The land had kept every promise his family had broken. When a 68-year-old veteran and his dog were left with nothing but a truck, a rifle, and 40 acres of frozen Manitoba wilderness, no one expected them to last a week. Before we begin, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your city or your province. It means more than you know. The envelope had been sitting on the kitchen table for 3 days before Gordon Marsh finally opened it. He'd known what was inside. His daughter-in-law Tara had that particular way of sending things in writing when she didn't want to say them out loud. Clean, official, the kind of words that couldn't be argued with because they arrived already typed and signed. He'd recognized her handwriting on the outside and left it there beside the salt shaker while he made his coffee each morning and tried to decide whether knowing sooner would actually help anything. It didn't. The letter said what he'd been dreading for the better part of 2 years. His son Patrick had taken out a second mortgage on the property. Gordon's property, the 40 acres his father had cleared outside of Flin Flon, and the bank had called it in. Gordon had co-signed without reading closely enough. That had been his mistake. Patrick had meant well, or said he had, and Gordon had trusted him the way a father trusts a son he hasn't seen in 6 years. Because trust is sometimes the last thing you have left of a relationship. Bear was lying under the table when Gordon set the letter down. The old shepherd mix raised his head, brown eyes steady and soft, the white creeping around his muzzle deep enough now that he looked frosted. "You know what this means," Gordon said, not really expecting an answer. Bear's tail moved once against the floor, slow, deliberate. He knew something was wrong. He'd always known before Gordon did. Gordon had come back from 2 tours in Afghanistan, with a knee that predicted rain better than any weather service, and a particular dread of enclosed spaces that had never quite lifted. He'd spent 15 years after discharge working as a ranger with Manitoba parks, which suited him, because the trees didn't ask questions, and the work made sense in a way that most things hadn't. When he retired, he'd moved onto the family land, fixed the old trapper's cabin into something livable, and decided that was enough. He didn't need much. He had Bear and the lake, and enough firewood to see out winter. Then Patrick had called, and Gordon had signed without reading, because you don't say no to your son when he sounds that desperate. He sold the truck for cash. Not much, but enough. He packed what the cabin held that was worth keeping. His field kit from the ranger days, a good hunting knife, 2 wool blankets, the cast iron pan his mother had used until her hands gave out, a photo of Bear as a puppy that had somehow survived every move he'd ever made. He carried it all to the tree line in 2 trips while the bank's representative waited by the road in a running sedan with the heat on. Bear followed him on every trip, tail low, watching everything Gordon's hands touched. Outside, the wind had teeth. October in northern Manitoba didn't negotiate. Gordon stood at the edge of the property line and didn't look back. There was nothing behind him that belonged to him anymore. And turning around wouldn't change that. Bear walked close against his left leg, the way he'd been trained to during Gordon's worst years, grounding him, before Gordon even knew he needed grounding. They walked north. There was a crown land block Gordon had mapped during his ranger years. Rough country, Canadian Shield, granite outcroppings and jackpine flats, and a river called the Attic that ran cold and clean even in late season. Nobody used it. Too remote to log profitably, too far from any trail system to attract campers. He'd hiked it twice in his 30s, and remembered a particular formation of rock along the river's northern bend. A shelf of overhanging granite, maybe 20 feet deep, with a stone floor that stayed dry, even when the ground around it turned to mud. He didn't know if it was still there. Memory and reality had a way of disagreeing when you were 68 years old and walking into the bush with a dog and a pack in October. But it was the only card he had. The first night they slept under a spruce stand, Gordon wrapped in both blankets with Bear pressed against his chest. The ground was cold and hard, and his knee throbbed in the particular way it always did when the temperature dropped fast. He didn't sleep much. He lay there and listened to the river sound somewhere below them. and tried to remember everything his father had taught him about wintering in rough country a long time ago, before Gordon had decided to become a soldier instead. Some things don't leave you. That was the mercy of it. They found the rock shelf 2 days later, mid-afternoon, when the light was going flat, and Gordon's pack straps had worn grooves into his shoulders. He could feel even through the jacket. Bear found it. Really. He'd gone ahead on a scent. Gordon couldn't read and was sitting at the granite edge, looking back at Gordon with that expression that meant he'd done something worth noticing. Gordon stood at the entrance and let himself breathe. It was smaller than memory had it. Most things were, but the floor was dry. The overhang deep enough that snow would have trouble reaching the back wall. And when he stepped inside and held his lighter up, he could see the ceiling was high enough to stand in the back 2/3. The front third sloped downward toward the opening, which meant cold air would pool there, and the sleeping space deeper in would hold heat better. His father had taught him that. Cold air sinks, sleep high when you can. Bear walked the perimeter twice, nose working before he sat in the center and looked at Gordon again. "All right," Gordon said quietly. "Let's make something of it." The first problem was fire, not starting one. Gordon had started fires in rain, in sand, in temperatures that turned diesel to gel, but keeping one burning without the smoke drowning them. The granite shelf had no natural chimney, just a ceiling that angled down to the open face. He tried a fire near the entrance, and the smoke rose and flattened and came back in on the wind. He tried it further back, and it was worse. Bear moved to the far wall and pressed himself flat, coughing. Gordon sat down on the stone floor and put his face in his hands. His chest hurt, not from the smoke, or not only from that. There was the other hurt, the one that didn't have a location exactly. That was more like a pressure behind the sternum that sometimes came when he stopped moving and let himself think about what his life looked like from the outside. 68. No home. No family within reach, a dog and a piece of crown land, and whatever was left of 40 years of knowing how to survive things. Bear crawled toward him on his belly and put his head on Gordon's knee. Gordon kept his face in his hands for another minute. Then he took a breath and looked up. The smoke from the dying fire was moving strangely. Not rising, not spreading, it was drifting sideways, slowly toward the right-hand wall, pulled by something. Gordon got up and crossed to the wall. He pressed his palm flat against the granite, cold but not uniformly. There was a seam running diagonally upward, and along it a faint current, air moving upward through the stone. He took the lighter and held it near the seam. The flame bent distinctly toward the rock. A draft, natural, upward-moving, continuous. He stood very still for a moment. Then he started thinking about how to use it. It took him the better part of 2 days. He used flat stones from the riverbank to build a low channel along the ground, angling it toward the seam, giving the air a path to follow. He packed clay from the riverbank into the gaps, sealing the channel on the sides so the draft would draw upward instead of spreading. He positioned the fire at the base of the channel, inside a ring of stones, and fed it slowly. The smoke rose, hesitated, then followed the draft upward into the seam and disappeared into the rock. Gordon sat back on his heels and watched it for a long time without speaking. Bear pressed against his side and exhaled. "Yeah," Gordon said, "I know." He gathered wood for the rest of that afternoon, with a steadiness he hadn't felt since before the letter. His hands knew this work. His body remembered purpose, even when his mind had gone quiet and gray. Bear ranged alongside him, occasionally dragging branches by the end, dropping them near the shelter entrance with the concentrated seriousness of an animal who understood the assignment. By the time the stars came out, Gordon had a woodpile waist-high and a fire that burned clean and warm, smoke threading silently upward through the stone. He cooked the last of his tinned beans in the cast-iron pan and split them with Bear, eating slowly, sitting close to the heat. The nights were getting longer. He could feel winter coming the way he'd always been able to, in the tissue of the old injury, in the way the air tasted in the mornings. He had shelter and heat now. What he didn't have was food. That thought kept him awake longer than the cold. The Otic River ran fast along the northern bend, but slowed in a wide pool 30 meters downstream, where the granite pushed out into the water and forced it around a curve. Gordon crouched at the edge in the early morning and watched it. The water was clear and cold, and he could see the dark shapes of fish moving near the bottom. Grayling, he thought. Maybe some small jackfish in the shallows, too fast to catch with a line where the current ran strong. But in the pool, if the water slowed enough, if the bottom dropped away enough to create the right conditions. Bear sat beside him, staring into the water the same way Gordon was. He'd built temporary dams before, during his ranger days, to divert water from washouts or create temporary pools for wildlife monitoring. He knew the principle. You needed the right stones, curved, heavy, flat-faced, and you needed to work with the current instead of against it, using the water's own force to press the structure tighter. It took the better part of 3 days and cost him more than he'd budgeted for in terms of strength. The water was shockingly cold, cold enough that his hands went past, numb into something that felt like burning. And he had to come back to the shelter to warm them before he could work again. Once he slipped on a submerged rock and went down hard, the current dragging at him before Bear caught his sleeve and hauled backward with everything he had. All 40-some pounds of old shepherd muscle, until Gordon found his footing again. He sat on the bank afterward for a long time, wet and shaking. Bear pressed against him, sharing heat. That could have been bad, Gordon said. Bear licked his face once, practical and no nonsense. Gordon laughed, short and involuntary. Yeah, he said. Thank you. The dam worked. By the 4th day, the pool had deepened by nearly 2 feet, and the fish had moved into it, holding in the calmer water. Gordon fashioned a spear from a straight jackpine branch and hardened the tip in the fire, the way his father had shown him when he was 10 years old, and stood in the shallows. At first light, when the fish were closest to the surface, he caught 2 grayling the first morning. They were beautiful fish, iridescent in the early light, and he felt the particular complicated gratitude that comes from killing something you need. He cleaned them at the water's edge and carried them back to the shelter and cooked them over the fire with the pine boughs, the way he'd eaten fish in the bush since he was a boy. Bear got his share and ate with a seriousness and speed that told Gordon everything about how hungry they'd both been pretending not to be. They were 3 weeks into the bush when the old man found them. Gordon heard him before he saw him. A steady crunch of snowshoes on the crust that had formed overnight, coming from the east along the riverbank. Bear heard it too, and came to attention beside Gordon, ears forward, but his tail was low rather than bristled. He'd learned to read Bear's signals over years, and that combination meant caution, not threat. Gordon waited by the shelter entrance, hands loose at his sides. The man who appeared around the bend of the river was perhaps 80, moving slowly, but with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd been moving through bush country for so long that efficiency had replaced speed entirely. He wore a canvas coat that had been repaired many times and carried a pack frame of a style Gordon hadn't seen since the 1980s. He stopped when he saw them and raised a hand. "Morning," he called. "Didn't know anyone was working this stretch." Gordon nodded. "Didn't know anyone else came through here." The man looked at Bear with the calm assessment of someone who'd spent a life around working dogs. "Shepherd Cross," he said. "Good coat for the cold." His name was Clifford Tanner, and he'd been trapping the Attic watershed for 53 years. Which meant he'd been at it since before Gordon had joined the army. He lived in a small cabin 12 kilometers north, and came through every few weeks to check his lines. He'd seen Gordon smoke the day before, and had come to see who was burning. He looked at the shelter, the stone channel Gordon had built, the firewood stacked high, the dam visible through the trees, and he was quiet for a long time. "You build all that yourself?" he asked. Gordon said yes. Clifford was quiet again. Then he took off his pack and set it down and said, "I've got smoked whitefish and dried blueberries if you haven't eaten yet." His voice was matter-of-fact, The way people are when generosity is just part of how they move through the world, and they'd find it strange to make a ceremony of it. Gordon said, "I haven't, thank you." They ate sitting on flat stones near the fire, Bear positioned between them, watching Clifford with a steady attention that softened gradually into something like acceptance. Clifford fed Bear a piece of whitefish from his hand without being asked, and that was when Gordon knew the man could be trusted. Clifford asked a few questions and listened to the answers without commentary. He'd known men like Gordon before. He said this plainly, not unkindly. Men who'd been through things that left marks and had ended up in the bush because the bush didn't require them to explain themselves. He said it was more common than people knew. Gordon didn't answer that. Before he left, Clifford paused and looked at the shelter again. "That chimney draft you found," he said. "That's not luck. That's either skill or the land looking after you. Maybe both." "He's looking after me," Gordon said and nodded at Bear. Clifford smiled at that. Then he shouldered his pack and headed back north along the river, his snowshoes marking a clean line in the crust. Gordon watched him go until the trees closed behind him. Then he turned and looked at Bear, who was watching him with those unhurried brown eyes. "Good country," Gordon said quietly. "Good country still has good people in it." Bear's tail moved once. The cold came in earnest 10 days after that. Not the preparatory cold of early November, but the serious kind. The kind that drops overnight and is still there 3 weeks later, when you've almost convinced yourself it's eased off. The temperature fell to -30 and stayed. The river slowed and then stilled, the pool freezing first at the edges, then across the center, until only a thin channel at the dam face kept moving. Gordon kept the fire burning through the nights, sleeping in shifts, waking to feed it and then lying back down with Bear curled against his side. His knee had given up on being subtle and simply ached, all the time now, a dull constant presence he moved around rather than through. His chest had developed a cough that came and went, more pronounced in the mornings when the cold was sharpest. He didn't examine it too closely. The shelter had become something by then. He'd extended the stone channel along the back wall and built a second tier of stacked timber along the open face, reducing the entrance to a narrow gap he could seal with a flat stone when the wind came from the northwest. He'd packed the gaps with a mixture of clay and moss that had frozen solid and was now better insulation than he could have manufactured. The space was small and low and smelled of wood smoke and dog and damp wool, and it was, in some way he didn't have language for, more his than anything had been in years. He was reinforcing the entrance wall one afternoon, recutting the notches in the top timber to get a tighter fit, when Bear made a sound he didn't usually make, a low sustained note, not quite a growl. That meant something unfamiliar was close. Gordon set down his hatchet without hurrying. He didn't look toward the trees immediately, just listened. Voices, 2 of them, maybe 3, north of the river. Then the crack of a rifle, somewhere in the jack pines on the far bank. Clifford had mentioned it, his first visit. There were men who ran trap lines on the Crown land without registering, who had been doing it long enough to consider it theirs, and who did not respond well to finding someone living on territory they thought of as their own. He'd said it matter-of-factly, without alarm, the way you tell someone about weather. Gordon kept very still. Bear came to his side and stayed there, pressed against his leg, silent now. The voices moved east, following the far bank. They didn't cross the river. After 20 minutes, the sound faded. Gordon let out a long breath. He looked at Bear. "We need to be less visible," he said. He spent the next 2 days reducing the shelter's profile, stacking snow against the outer wall until it blended with the surrounding drifts, covering the woodpile with pine boughs, restricting the fire to daytime hours when the smoke would dissipate faster and be less visible at night. He built a cache for the smoked fish Clifford had taught him to prepare, tucked back in the trees. He was quieter after that, more deliberate. He'd spent enough years in country where being seen by the wrong people had consequences to know when to move like he wasn't there. The worst night came without warning. the way the worst things always do. He'd been sleeping, really sleeping. Not the shallow, vigilant rest of the first weeks, but actual sleep, heavy and dreamless, when Bear's weight left his side. He was awake instantly, the old reflex, a soldier's reflex. Bear was at the entrance, pressing his nose to the gap at the bottom of the stone door. Something was wrong with the air inside. Gordon sat up and tasted it. Smoke. Not the familiar clean smoke of the draft working properly, but something thick and low, the kind that spreads instead of rises. His fire had burned down to coals, and the draft in the seam had reversed. A pressure shift outside, wind coming from a direction that changed everything. And now the smoke was coming back down instead of going up. He shoved the entrance stone aside, and the cold hit him like a wall. -30-something, maybe colder, with a wind that had come up from the north and was pressing against the cliff face above the shelter. That was it. The wind was blocking the draft. Bear pushed past him, coughing. Gordon's lungs seized when he stepped outside, not from smoke now, but from the raw cold hitting tissue that wasn't ready for it. He stood there for a second, orienting himself. Dark, the stars hard and clear, the wind cutting, and then he started climbing. The seam exited through the cliff face about 12 feet up. He knew it was there because he'd found the exterior opening in the first week. Now he had to reach it in the dark with bare hands and frozen rock. He'd done harder climbs. Not recently, and not with this knee, but the muscle memory was there, and he went up in stages, finding holds, not looking down. Bear circled below him on the snow, making that low, worried sound. The opening was packed with blown snow, dense and hard. Gordon dug at it with his fingers until they stopped registering properly, then kept digging. When the first piece broke free, he could feel the pressure change immediately, like something taking a breath. He worked faster, cracking ice, scooping out packed snow, until the opening was clear and the draft reversed again, pouring upward past his fingers. Getting down was harder. His hands weren't working right, and his knee had locked in the cold. He came off the last 3 feet, not quite in control, landing hard enough to jar his spine, and lay in the snow for a moment, looking up at the stars. Bear was on him immediately, warm weight and urgent breath, pawing at his chest. "I'm here," Gordon said. "I'm all right." He wasn't entirely sure of that, but he got up. Inside, the fire rebuilt itself with his coaxing smoke rising clean and straight now, the draft doing its work. Gordon sat near it and let his hands thaw slowly, which was one of the more purely unpleasant sensations he'd experienced. And he'd experienced a range. Bear wrapped himself against Gordon's legs and stayed there, radiating heat, watching Gordon's face. Gordon looked back at him for a long time. "You've been doing this since Fort Bragg," he said, "looking after me when I didn't want to admit I needed it." Bear didn't look away. Gordon put his hand on the dog's head and kept it there. His hands had stopped shaking, but the cold had gone bone deep, and it would be a while before he felt warm again. He sat there, letting the fire do its work, listening to the wind, trying to find a way through the walls and not succeeding. The storm that followed lasted 2 full days. Gordon barely left the shelter. He fed the fire and watched the entrance gap for snow accumulation, and kept the draft clear by tapping the seam with a stick every few hours. He ate dried fish and snow melted in the pan. Bear ate his share and then pressed himself against Gordon's side and slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a dog who had done what he came to do. On the second morning, Gordon woke to silence. Not the muffled silence of a storm still running, but the particular crystalline silence of a world that has stopped. He pressed the entrance stone aside, and the light came in white and absolute, the kind of brightness that makes you squint even in cold. The snow had piled 4 feet against the outer wall. The trees were buried to their first branches. The river was silent and still under a solid lid of ice. Bear bounded past him into the snow, kicking up powder, plunging to his chest, reversing and doing it again with a concentrated joy that didn't need any audience. Gordon stood at the entrance and watched him and felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been held in place by sheer necessary tension for weeks. He breathed in the cold, clean air and let it out again. and the steam of it rose in the still morning and hung there for a moment before dissolving. Clifford came by the next afternoon with more whitefish and a look on his face that said he'd been worried but wasn't going to say so directly. He walked around the shelter once, examining the repairs Gordon had made. The snowpack along the walls, the chimney seam clear above. "Still standing," Clifford said. Gordon said, "Still standing." They ate together again, the three of them, and Clifford mentioned that people in Flin Flon had apparently started referring to the smoke they occasionally saw rising from the Crown Land as the Marsh fire. Said it the way people say things when they're not sure if it's a compliment or not. Gordon chewed his fish. "Is that what they're calling it?" he said. "Some of them think you're crazy," Clifford said without apparent judgment. "Some of them are probably right," Gordon said. Bear lifted his head and looked between them, and thumped his tail twice against the snow. The winter settled in after that with a kind of permanence, the way it does in the north when it has fully arrived. Gordon moved through the days with a steadiness he recognized from his ranger years, the rhythm of cold weather work, fuel, food, water, shelter, in that order, every day, no exceptions. His cough got a little worse in the mornings, and a little better by midday, and he decided to treat it as information rather than a problem until the information changed. He fished through the ice now, cutting a hole above the dam where the water was deepest. Using a line made from paracord and a hook fashioned from a bent pin from his pack. The grayling were slower in the cold and easier to take, which he was grateful for in a way he would have found embarrassing to explain. He smoked what he caught over the fire, hanging the fish from a wire rack he'd bent from wire, saved from an old pack frame and stored them in the cache. It wasn't abundance, but it was enough, and in his experience enough was the thing that people underestimated when they were busy wanting more. One afternoon in the deep cold of January, while he was reinforcing the north side of the shelter wall, where frost had worked into a gap and widened it, Bear went still behind him. Not the alert stillness of hearing something unfamiliar, a different kind of stillness. Gordon turned around. Bear was standing near the back wall of the shelter, where the stone curved inward and the shadows deepened even when the fire was bright. He was looking at something Gordon hadn't paid attention to, a place where two slabs of granite met at an angle near the floor. Bear took one slow step toward it, then stopped and looked back at Gordon. Gordon crossed the shelter and crouched beside him. The seam where the slabs met was slightly wider than the surrounding rock, and when Gordon held his palm near it, he felt not the upward draft of the chimney seam, but a horizontal current, air moving outward, cool and steady, from somewhere behind the stone. He took his hatchet and tapped along the face of the right-hand slab. The sound changed 2 feet from the edge. Not the solid ring of deep granite, but a hollow note, the sound of space behind. Bear lowered his nose to the base of the slab and exhaled through his nostrils. Then he looked up. Gordon sat back on his heels. This shelter, this particular curve of rock on this particular bend of the Attic River, on Crown land nobody wanted, that he'd found because he was out of options, and had walked north because there was nowhere else to go. The seam that had given them heat, the pool that had given them food. And now this. He placed his palm flat against the slab and felt the stone breathe. He didn't open it that night. He wasn't sure he was ready for what it might say. Some doors were better opened in the daylight, with a full stomach when a man could think clearly. He went back to the fire and sat down, and Bear came and lay across his feet, and Gordon watched the flame pull upward through the chimney seam in a clean, steady line, exactly as it had learned to do. Outside, the Attic ran dark and quiet under its lid of ice. The spruce stood loaded with snow, patient as they always were. The stars were out in numbers that would have stunned anyone who hadn't lived long enough north to know what a sky looks like when there's no one around to dull it. Gordon Marsh had lost a house made of wood and a piece of paper. What he had built in its place was something that had no name on any deed, that belonged to no bank, that could not be repossessed or mortgaged or signed away. He had built it from stone and clay and knowledge and stubbornness, and the particular wordless partnership of a man and a dog who had decided, both of them, that this particular life was worth the trouble of continuing. He carved into the stone beside the entrance one evening, slow, careful letters with the tip of his hunting knife. Two old soldiers, still standing. Bear inspected the carving when he was done, sniffing each letter, tail moving in that slow, deliberate way. Gordon sat back against the shelter wall and looked at what he'd made of 40 acres of rock and river and cold sky and nothing else. It wasn't what he'd planned. It wasn't what anyone who knew him would have predicted, but it was his, in the truest sense of that word, earned by every hour of cold and hunger and fear that he hadn't let stop him. The stone behind the right-hand slab was still waiting. Whatever was behind it, a deeper chamber, another passage, something else entirely, would be there in the morning. And Gordon Marsh, 68 years old, 2 wars in his past and 1 Manitoba winter holding him in its fist, was still curious enough to want to find out.